tonight I'm very excited about our topic, and it is entitled Women's Health and Integrative Medicine. Our featured presenter is Dr. Raymond Teets. Dr. Teets is a board-certified family medicine physician who is faculty at the Beth Israel Residency Program in Urban Family Medicine. In addition to being faculty, he practices integrative family medicine in the Institute for Family Health, a community health center. He received his MD from MCP Hanneman Medical School and did his residency in family medicine at Trident Family Medicine. He also did a fellowship in the program in integrative medicine at the University of Arizona, and currently is a director of the integrative medicine curriculum at Beth Israel. This presentation has been approved for 1 hour of CE credit through AAFP. Questions and/or comments can be presented to Dr. Teets throughout the presentation. In addition to, he will pause at certain times to answer questions. So please feel free to type your questions and comments in the Q&A box located at the left-hand bottom of your screen and click the submit button. And with that said, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Teets.
Hi everyone. I'm just looking for the slideshow. There it is. So thanks Sabrina for the great introduction. And let me just make sure I'm working this right. Sabrina, I'm just having trouble where I need to be able to see the slide. Oh, wait a minute, I think I can fix it. Never mind. Forgive me for still learning this. Okay, so tonight's topic is integrative medicine and women's health, as Sabrina said. And in compliance, I do not have any financial relationships with any of the manufacturers or any commercial services discussed in this educational activity. So my name is, as she has said, and just some information about me. I think, part of how I'm able to bring this to my work is I am director of the integrative medicine curriculum that we have for our residency. We also bring this to medical students that rotate through. I have an integrative practice here in the residency practice, and then also am working on bringing more integrative services to our patients. We're in a community healthcare center in an underserved designated area, and so at present we do have some acupuncture, we do have some yoga for our pregnancy groups, we have osteopathic manipulation, so it's kind of exciting. I have some supportive administration to bring that stuff here. But what to talk about today, integrative medicine, I want to spend a minute just to define it, in part because there's no, board certification for integrative medicine. To be honest, in the industry, anyone can say they're integrative medicine. But what it is for us, how we teach it, how I practice it, is it's, as many people know, the combination of complementary and alternative medicine, or CAM, and then conventional Western medicine. It's intended also to be holistic or a patient-centered approach. Sort of where's the patient at, how can we create rapport there, a little bit more of a collegial approach around patient empowerment. And then the one concept that I think is new, that you don't see, let's say, in family medicine or other disciplines, is wellness as a viable approach. And I'll talk a little bit more about wellness as we go forth in context. But, briefly, it's the idea of how can we do things that should increase health, even if they're not always disease or illness or diagnosis focused. It also brings to bear with integrative medicine multiple ways to improve patient health, whether we're talking about supplements or herbs, nutrition, lifestyle changes, or mind-body modalities. So to be more explicit about what CAM is, or complementary alternative medicine, there's lifestyle recommendations that sort of fall within that rubric, nutritional recommendations, exercise, stress management, you can see some listed there, herbs or what are called dietary supplements, body work, chiropractic, osteopathy, and then there's other health systems that, like for instance, I'll do a referral to acupuncture or refer someone to a Chinese medicine practitioner. Homeopathy is yet another. The objectives today is I want to introduce the principles of integrative medicine as we were just going over. I want to explore issues germane to quality and efficacy in dietary supplements, hopefully to facilitate folks' use of evidence-based CAM modalities in women's health, and then explore issues germane to recommendations around the food and the supplements that we talk about. And so the conditions, forgive me, the conditions that we'll talk about today will include menopause, premenstrual syndrome, osteoporosis, pregnancy, and interconception care. And really what I'm hoping to do in a broad sketch is to give a real practical vision of what integrative medicine can be. There'll be these case studies that we'll go through, and hopefully you'll find that useful, and basically we'll run through those with different explanations in context. I will be a little more focused on dietary supplements in the slideshow today, but I'm open to fielding questions so far. But given how the evidence is, we're sort of focusing on that. So to talk a little bit about dietary supplements, that was a legal category actually created fairly recently in 1994 by the Dietary Supplement Acts. Of course, these substances were around, but they weren't regulated in the same way. So now they're regulated sort of different than food and different from pharmaceuticals. It's this sort of middle term or third term. And it's regulated really largely in terms of how it can be marketed. It's not regulated, obviously, by the FDA. It's not regulated in terms of how it's produced or efficacy, etc. Obviously, part of what's really different about dietary supplements, too, is that patients can purchase them themselves without the typical gatekeeper role that we've accustomed to as doctors with pharmaceuticals. And then, obviously, there's practical issues then. So how do we talk about quality? How do we talk about safety and the efficacy? And where does the evidence sort of fall with that? So that's what we'll talk about more. Given all that, given that, patients are, using these, that there isn't tons of evidence always, which I'll talk about. How does a person make a decision? I mean, how do we sort of see this when the language of the day is about evidence-based medicine? And the idea, this was a concept that I actually heard from Dr. Andy Weil, which I thought was useful because it's something that we do all the time with whether we're talking about conventional medicine or complementary alternative medicine, is it's the sliding scale of risk. And it's the idea that generally when we think about therapies, we think about the evidence, whether it's low or high, and a very simplistic rubric. And then we also think about risk. And so as it's kind of obvious, we want to avoid a high risk, low evidence therapy, and we want to try to find the highest evidence with low risk therapies. I mean, that's our sort of goal. With the sliding scale of risk then, to fill this out, what you can see is that, so, meditation, for instance, presumably is a low risk. There's not any risk that we can think of that are typically going to be involved with that. The evidence of benefit in many cases, if you're thinking about, let's say, psoriasis, there are some research studies, for instance, that look at meditation as a therapy for psoriasis, and there's some evidence to suggest that it could be helpful. But they're small studies. There's lots of issues, as you can imagine, around how you be rigorous with studies around that. But there's low evidence of benefit, but there's also low risk. Folic acid, I think, is a great example of a high evidence of benefit and very low risk if you talk about folic acid in the context of pregnancy. We do high risk and high evidence of benefit. Chronic prednisone may be an exemplar of that if we're talking about it in the context of rheumatoid arthritis, let's say. Clearly it appears to have evidence, but clearly it has risk. And then chemotherapy for some cancers is low evidence of benefit, but we try it because we need to take that risk, even though it is a high one. So in a more practical way to help guide this, there are things that we can use. So the first is thinking about quality. Is the supplement what it says it is? Now, as I said, for supplements, that's where the FDA would work for pharmaceuticals, but we don't have that. So what is regulated in the U.S. is truth claims. Some of you may be familiar that the person who created Airborne made a claim about it helped with colds or helped with the flu, and they actually were brought to task on that, and that was against the regulations around a supplement. You can't make claims about diagnoses with supplements. So that's why you see, if you look at glucosamine sulfate, if you're familiar with that, you know, people use it for arthritis, is you'll see on the side it's good for bone health. So you can make what are called structure function claims. You can say, okay, this supplement is good for this kind of structure or this kind of situation, but you can't talk about diagnoses. You can't say on the bottle, or you can't advertise that glucosamine is good for arthritis, even though arguably there's evidence for it. Now, there are situations where you can get validation of the manufacturing practices, and that's where the USP, the United States Pharmacopoeia, or the NSF, which is also a governmental organization, can validate. They can go in and my understanding is that the manufacturers have to ask for this, but they'll go in and they'll look at how the supplements are made, and if they're made in a way that follows good manufacturing practices, then you'll see these stamps that I have pictured here, the USP or the NSF. And then there's a third party that has set itself up as a service to do third-party testing. And again, you know, a manufacturer of supplement X would have to ask Consumer Lab to do this testing, but they'll do it. They'll look at a fish oil, for instance, and they'll say, okay, are the fish oils the dose they say it is, are they free of any kind of pollution, things like that. They'll also do sometimes testing around, does the actual pill disintegrate when it's supposed to, things like that. The second question, obviously, beyond safety and safety and quality, is then also thinking about efficacy or effectiveness. And the database that I'll often use is the Natural Medicines Comprehensive Database, and there is another one too called Natural Standards, which arguably is also quite good. Both of these are databases that will, if there's research on St. John's wort, for instance, it's going to be in this database, and it basically will guide the practitioner through issues of safety, through issues of efficacy for specific diagnoses, and also talk about some background, propose some mechanism of actions, etc. It's a pretty thorough application or database, and you have to pay for it, but it's really useful. And then the trick there is, okay, so you can see studies, but then how do you sort of bring that to bear on clinical practice? And some of the differences with dietary supplements versus pharmaceuticals is, again, you know, the studies need to be transparent. So if you find a study in Natural Medicine's Comprehensive Database, you pull it from PubMed or what have you, that study should say very clearly what they used. Okay, we used, you know, St. John's wort, this specific extract. We used the leaves of St. John's wort, or we used the flowers, which are typically used, not the root, for instance. If they talk about extracts, they may talk about standardized extracts, and those are just basically a language designed to say, okay, we took the crude herb St. John's wort and then we processed it so that it had this particular standard extract for whatever percentage. And that's a way not to clearly say that that's the active principle. That's actually not what a standardized extract is by definition. It's simply a marker for efficacy. So that's some of the language you'll see when you look at an article about research. The studies, unfortunately, are often not large, which obviously limits how you can extrapolate. And part of this is just funding. You know, when you don't have a product that's always patentable, you're not going to bring the same amount of money to bear to get a multi-center trial. So they tend to be smaller studies. You can sometimes get pooled. You can get a lot of meta-analyses, but those have their issues. And then the trick is, okay, so then you find a good study that talks about a transparent product, and then you have to figure out, okay, so how do I get that product? How do I get that standardized extract in the marketplace? And that's something that I will talk about as I go through the case studies. And my personal advice is to be explicit with patients like a prescription. And that brings us sort of the guidelines that we'll use for our residents, we use for ourselves. I use for myself here at the institute where I work, which is, you know what forms of the supplements used in the research. You know, try to use, you don't always have to know what part of the plant, because if you just need, you know, more often you'll know if it's some sort of process. And if it's standardized, you want to know standardized to what. And then you want, my recommendation is to suggest the supplement in a similar way as you would suggest a pharmaceutical, meaning you give to the patient on paper, okay, I recommend St. John's wort, this particular standardized extract. You can find it in these brands, and I would take it, you know, 300 milligrams 3 times a day for, a month, and then, see how you feel, or take it for 4 months and see me back. So I think there's a way in which, if we're hoping that the supplements can be helpful, we want to use sort of our power on paper as we do with prescriptions. When we give a patient information about a pharmaceutical, it comes in the form of a prescription. Either now, obviously, you can send it directly to the pharmacy, but in theory, on paper, and the same goes, I think, or the same makes sense for dietary supplements. So that was a lot of abstract information in the sense of not in context. I don't see any questions coming through, but if there are, certainly I can talk about them, or I'd be happy to answer. But the case examples hopefully will bring it to bear a little more clearly. So the first one we'll talk about is a case example of a woman with menopause. Allison is a 48-year-old woman with hypertension who presents with symptoms of hot flashes. Her periods are scant, and only about 2 days long, and the last one was about 2 months ago. She has some difficulty with insomnia. The hot flashes will keep her up, but also just frustrations of life with family. So some of it is not simply just the hot flashes, but also some low-grade anxiety. A PHTU2 is done. It's negative for depression. If you're familiar with that, that's a screening tool. And then she does take HCTZ for her blood pressure, which is controlled. She has a remote family of breast cancer in her 50s. And of course, so her question is, so how can I help with these hot flashes? And like a lot of women, she's not real keen on taking hormone therapy. That's not really the direction she wants to go if she can avoid it. So further discussion with her, a 24-hour recall for nutrition, reveals low amounts of fruits and vegetables, higher amounts of processed carbohydrates. And that's my recommendation if you're going to do a nutrition. Ideally in an integrative interview, you do want to find out about nutrition, because nutrition can have effects on health. And one of the ways to make that more useful, so that it's not simply a patient saying, well, I don't eat very well, or I do eat well, is to do a 24-hour recall where you say, okay, so what did you have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner yesterday, and also tell me what you did in between in terms of snacks or coffee or what have you. So you can see with her, and then also she drinks 3 to 4 cups of coffee a day. She'll exercise 3 or 4 times a week, doesn't want to try the hormone therapy, as I said, likes the idea of using something natural. And then thankfully she actually brings the product in that she's using, which is a combination of red clover, primrose oil, and calcium. And for, just as a beginning, you take a look at it and you remember that red clover does have some phytoestrogen components. Evening primrose oil is an oil that is a common supplement for women's health, and that's maybe what you remember. But so the question is, so what next? Is that way to go? What do we know about the evidence? So starting first with phytoestrogens. Phytoestrogens are, as the name implies, they're a class of compounds with estrogen-like action that come from plants, derived from plants. I mentioned soy and red clover here, but to be quite honest, they're actually quite maybe ubiquitous isn't the right word, but quite common in the plant world. Most legumes or beans will have some phytoestrogen component, soy being an example of a legume, and then the red clover, and there's others as well. The isolates that you'll see, meaning, so if you take the soy and then you process it down, you can find isolates, genistein and daidzein, and you'll sometimes see these studied in the literature. And then you'll sometimes also see a synthetic isoflavone, and now isoflavone is one type of phytoestrogen, iproflavone, and again you'll see that sometimes researched and marketed as a phytoestrogen. So I go over it in part because I feel like a lot of this stuff is presented in the lay press or is batted around, and hopefully it's useful to know the background. A lot of the interest in phytoestrogens came out of epidemiological studies looking at experiences of Asian women in East Asia, their experience around hot flashes in menopause in Korea, China, etc., versus women's experiences with menopausal symptoms in quote-unquote the Western world. And as probably a lot of you have heard, there's this epidemiologic data that suggests that the menopausal symptoms aren't as prominent in some of those Asian countries, and so the question is why. And that's where, you know, the soy in particular became such a interesting food. What we found as we've done more studies is that so you have the epidemiological data, but then with all the research on phytoestrogens, it's not exactly clear that the phytoestrogens are always efficacious in this context. We found that metabolism in the gut can produce more potent compounds, for instance, and that surmises that may have a role in Asian populations, but it's also widely varied amongst different population groups. Part of it too is fermented soy. It's basically soy, like tofu is fermented, tempeh is fermented, soy sauce is fermented soy, and those may provide more potent effects. Essentially, they're allowing for these phytoestrogens to be a little more bioavailable, probably, for the person ingesting them. And of course, you can ingest these phytoestrogens as whole foods. There's no reason you have to get a pill like this woman brings in with red clover isolate or red clover extract. If you eat beans, if you're eating soy products, you're ingesting phytoestrogens along with that. So do phytoestrogens help in menopause? A lot of contradictory evidence. There's a lot of studies out there that some show positive, some show negative. And basically the North American Menopause Society in 2000 released a statement saying, you know what, it doesn't appear that they clearly have benefit for menopause. The society was willing to say, look, the whole foods have physiologic benefits, meaning they have phytoestrogens, they can have good effects, and so it may be worthwhile to eat those, along with this idea that fermented foods may bring more phytoestrogens to bear. That may have more effects than the non-fermented foods, and probably it's worth recommending isolated extracts, like in this case with the red clover extract. There's just, in my opinion, my personal bias is that if a person can achieve improvements in health through whole foods, that's generally the route I'll go. It often can be more inexpensive, it often can be cheaper, and also generally you're also going to be in a situation with less risk, because obviously if you start to isolate or extract out things from foods, as you move into the supplement world, you often then you might get more potency, but you also might get more risk along with that. Obviously seeing an analog there with pharmaceuticals. You know, the question always comes up, well, what if I have a personal history of, if a woman comes in and says, what if I have a personal history of breast cancer? Should I eat soy, or should I take soy extracts for, you know, my menopausal symptoms? And arguably, certainly the isolated extracts should be contraindicated in estrogen-sensitive conditions. You know, the data is not completely clear. There are ways in which phytoestrogens can be estrogen antagonists, and in that sense may not be a problem, but it's just not clear. And so I think thinking about the sliding scale of risk here, that it's not worth the while to recommend isolated extracts of phytoestrogens for women with, you know, first-degree history of breast cancer, and certainly breast cancer history. The question comes up then about foods. Well, can I eat soy? Can I eat miso? I like, you know, going to sushi restaurants, etc. And there it's not clear that you would have to restrict it. Certainly would be careful about heavy consumption. And I will tell you, it's a really hard question to answer about absolute, should I eat soy or not when it comes to breast cancer risk, as an example of an estrogen sensitive condition. And there's a question actually about, let me see, make sure I can read it. So I've heard that soy can cause harm to thyroid, causing hypothyroidism. Any thoughts? It appears that soy does have some what they call goitrogenic capabilities, meaning they can be associated with goiter. It's a little bit, my understanding is it's a little bit more of a theoretical risk than a clear clinical outcome type risk. So if there was, you know, it would be something to think of. I mean, if you had a person with Hashimoto's, particularly with emerging Hashimoto's, and they said, you know what, I really don't want to go on Synthroid. Is there something I can do to avoid the hypothyroidism getting worse? And you know their TSH is in the 4s, and you have some room to spend some time working with them. You might say, you know, if you eat a lot of soy, you might draw back and see it as a trial for yourself to see in 6 weeks if the TSH stables out or gets a little bit better. And so working with a patient on that I think is reasonable. But it's certainly not clear otherwise that it's something that you clearly have to avoid with thyroid. We just don't have that kind of data that it's clearly a problem. So again, thinking about menopause and thinking about other approaches, and you can see there's no citations here. There's not a lot of evidence around clearly other approaches for menopause, although I think all of us have heard about, as we went through education, talking about coffee and decreasing hot liquids in coffee in particular to decrease hot flashes. My take on this is that, again, this is this idea of wellness. We heard from Allison that she's not eating a lot of whole fruits and vegetables. We heard that she eats a decent amount of processed carbohydrates. So the idea of decreasing those processed carbohydrates, the idea of increasing whole fruits and vegetables may well have good effect for her menopause. I mean, who knows? There's not clear evidence. Although, interestingly, to speak a little bit about if I appropriate a little bit of East Asian vision, oftentimes, a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner sees processed carbohydrates as being heating. Maybe not for all people, but for certain people it can be heating. So whereas whole fruits and vegetables, which take more work by the gut to digest, may not be as heating for a patient. So there's some way of thinking about this theoretically, but outside a conventional Western framework. But we know these are going to be healthy choices. Trial of decreasing coffee intake, there's not going to be risk with doing that necessarily, but I also don't think it makes sense to be didactic or absolute and say, no, you have to stop coffee. But again, working with the patient to say, well, you have menopause. It's not obviously something that's a disease, but it's something that we need to help you feel better with, and decreasing the coffee as a trial may well help. Continuing the exercises, again, all of these things are, wellness emphases, things that we can do to help the patient think about wellness. And then the stress relief, consider mind-body practice. The science suggests, and forgive me, I don't have a citation for this, but Herbert Benson, as an example, was one of the initial people to look at this, where when we can access these mind-body practices about like breath work or meditation, what we tend to see is that we can increase the parasympathetic tone of the body, which again fits in with the rest and digest part of the body. And so that's some of where the basic science comes from, that hey, breath work or meditation may well be helpful for stress relief. And then just to take one more step back about menopause and lifestyle changes is that from a conventional standpoint, sometimes menopause gets seen as, oh, this is a disease or an illness, when obviously menopause is a transition time for women, and for some women it comes with a certain high degree of symptoms, for others it comes with minimal symptoms. And so what I think is interesting and can be important is, on the one hand, being supportive of a woman as she goes through this transition and saying, okay, what can we do to help mitigate these symptoms that you're having that are obviously bothering you, like bothering Allison, while at the same time normalizing that transition is important and menopause is part of life, and that what can we do together that on the one hand doesn't make it a bad diagnosis, but on the other hand can help the patient feel better. And I feel like that's where the wellness and the lifestyle can be helpful, the lifestyle modifications, because it's something to offer as well as thinking about herbs and supplements. Which brings me to black cohosh, arguably one of the herbs that has some of the more evidence around menopause. Black cohosh has been used in North America for a long time prior to European folks coming here. The root and rhizome was used typically, and it was used actually for a lot of women's health kind of conditions. And there's a lot of studies done, a lot with methodological weaknesses. The majority are positive, and what we're seeing, for instance, in Osmer's 2005 and another one, is that you decrease the menopausal symptoms over the placebo. Typically what you see it help with is the hot flashes. That was, looking at that, and then some of the psychological symptoms that a patient will have or a woman will have. It was originally wondered and concerned that black cohosh may have estrogenic activity, but studies done while in the herb showed no change in the endometrial stripe. There's been no outcome studies to really suggest any clear endometrial activity, and there's been good safety data for at least a 12-month period. You know, controversy using in women high risk for breast cancer, it appears safe. I'm a little reluctant to say, you know, to go ahead and use it, but so far I would say that if I had a patient status post breast cancer, I would probably avoid it and look at other ways just to be 100% safe, but there appears to be no risk otherwise. There are two different standardized extracts that really predominantly were studied that had positive data, and you know, I show you these here. Obviously, don't worry about memorizing them, but there's two then products that you can find on the market. Menofem, I believe, is not as commonly found on the market anymore. I think it was taken off the market just not because of any safety issues, but just because it maybe wasn't making money. Remifemin, I believe, though, is still around, and basically you aim for the 20 milligrams to 40 milligrams BID. You can start at 20 and then titrate up to twice a day for Remifemin. The Menofem, if you do find it, is 40 milligrams a day. So you can see pretty similar doses. The side effects are usually pretty mild, maybe some GI upset. There are some not great studies, not great links, but some case reports with maybe a link of liver toxicity, mostly in women who already had some, or mostly in patients who already had some liver problems. So I will often do a baseline LFTs and then maybe check in 6 weeks to 2 or 3 months, but although the risk is still pretty low. If someone had liver disease, I wouldn't use black cohosh just to be safe. The mechanism, as I said previously, no clinical signs of estrogen effect. It may have opiate mu receptor interactions or dopamine, but we're really not quite sure. Part of what you get with herbs or botanicals is that it's hard to parse out. You're not looking at just one, you know, compound to decide what it's doing. Like if you were thinking about metoprolol, you look at metoprolol and you see what it does. But in this case, you know, you have a botanical that has a plethora of compounds that may be working together in synergy, or there may be one isolated compound. And so that's why you often find there's not clear mechanisms. There's no known drug interactions, and it is different than blue cohosh. Blue cohosh has a traditional use by midwives in pregnancy towards the end to sort of begin the parturition process, but it's not something that I have familiarity with. I just know of it. This is, I put the slide here. This is a screenshot from the electronic medical record that we have. It's called EPIC. And basically this is a patient instructions that can be printed out as part of what we call an after visit summary. The reason I have it is I just want to show this is what I will use, or this is how I will present the information on a supplement or an herb, or for that matter any integrative recommendation. I like to have it so that it's on paper, so that it prints out, so that the patient can walk away with something. You know, again, sort of analogous to how we do pharmaceuticals. The patient is given very specific information either by the pharmacist or by us, and I like that same approach for integrative medicine. I think it validates it. I think there's a big difference between saying to someone, well, maybe you should get a massage and have them walk out the door. Maybe you should see someone for acupuncture, as opposed to putting on paper, please see an acupuncturist, here's some numbers to call, etc., like a referral. So here you can see black cohosh, use what it's used for. You can use an extract under the name brand. The Remifemin I mentioned, enzymatic therapy is the place that makes it. Here's the dose. You can increase it, etc. So you can read that there. And then again, we'll often check their liver labs today and then repeat it. As a side note, for those of you who are in teaching, we also use these. These are what are called smart phrases that blow in very quickly, like prescriptions, and we also can use these for residency education, because as you can see, they also can stand alone for educating a provider who doesn't necessarily know a lot of black cohosh. They can find out this information there, and so they have something that's been vetted. That's what we've done for the practice, and then they have something they can give to a patient and learn at the same time. So evening primrose oil was also in the tablet that she brought in. It's a significant source of a type of linolenic acid, gamma as opposed to alpha linolenic acid. And we'll talk about alpha linolenic acid later, but it's a common supplement used in women's health. There is some data for breast tenderness, cyclic breast tenderness around periods that it can be helpful for. It's generally well tolerated, but there's no really clear data for menopause. At higher doses, like a lot of the oils, it can potentially bleeding time with NSAIDs or anticoagulants. So, 2 to 4 grams a day of evening primrose oil is not a particularly high dose, or at least it is a dose that you might see if you were to prescribe it to suggest it for cyclic nostalgia, for instance. But you just have to be cognizant if they have a bleeding risk, etc., or they're on NSAIDs, that you would have to be careful with it. So the recommendations for Allison, to sort of bring it back to the case, is that I think saying, look, phytoestrogens consumed as food might prove helpful for the hot flashes. And so an example of a dose would be, about 8 ounces of tofu. Now that's sizable for someone who doesn't eat any tofu at all, because that's, a decent amount. I'm not saying eat it one sitting, but nor would it necessarily always be tofu. If you look at an Asian diet, for instance, it would be tofu and miso and different things. So this is where, if you have a nutritionist you can work with, or if you know some information, it's helpful to deconstruct what it means to eat phytoestrogens. Decreased processed carbs may be helpful. And certainly they're good for a good diet and wellness. The trial of decreasing or avoiding caffeine, thinking about black cohosh might prove helpful as well. We talked about that, the remifemin. And I wouldn't recommend that particular supplement she brought in. I don't think necessarily it would do harm. She doesn't have, for instance, breast cancer history, personal or close family, so the red clover extract is probably not going to do her any harm, but she may not need to spend the money on it. And then there's a question here. Let me see, sorry. Do I have special alerts or contraindications, reminders in the EHR system that you're using? Good question. I mean, basically, everything right now that we're using around supplements and herbs, which really of CAM are the things that tend to bring more risk, are all in what I call these smart phrases, which have to be blown in by the provider. We do have some supplements or herbs in our medication database, but I haven't seen any warning or reminders come up. That's actually my hopeful next project, is to see how can we improve documentation and actually have, the black cohosh not simply documented in a note, but also documented in a searchable med list. And then also, how can we improve safety? And so, no, we don't right now. I think our medical record does have that capability, I'm pretty sure, but there's some things that would have to be tweaked for it to work for us. So moving on to the next case, a woman, Beatrice, with premenstrual syndrome, is 21-year-old. She gets symptoms of bloating, irritability, and headache around the time of her menses. She has no other medical conditions. She uses condoms for birth control and defers any hormonal contraception, not using supplements, vitamins, or herbs. Her 24-hour nutritional recall, sort of what you would say is a poor diet, or maybe a typical American diet, minimal fruits and vegetables, mostly just carbs and fat. So what's interesting about premenstrual syndrome is that vitamins and minerals actually have some good data. Calcium in particular has really good data, arguably some of the strongest of dietary supplements around helping PMS, decreased symptoms and bloating and poor mood. This Jacobs did a nice, pretty decent study. I mean, women her age should be on this calcium anyway. So one of the first things that we can do is really screen and say, hey, are you taking calcium on a daily basis? And if not, then that's the first recommendation we can do, and feel obviously really comfortable that it's going to be safe and an important thing, even if it doesn't clearly help the PMS in her situation. Obviously watching for constipation. With B6, there is some data that's been pulled out that it can be helpful for PMS. The dose you want to do is between 50 and 100 milligrams. Don't want to really exceed B6 above 100 milligrams. You can increase the adverse effects, including what can be an irreversible peripheral neuropathy. Usually you see that more at 200 milligrams or higher, but again, there's no improvement with higher doses, so you don't want to go above this. For those of you not usually familiar, the B-complex vitamin is usually named B-complex 100 for the B6 content, I think because of this risk. So a B-complex 100 tab, if you look at the ingredients, is 100 milligrams of B6. Magnesium can be helpful. It's not as strong of evidence as calcium and B6, but does suggest even at just 200 milligrams, which isn't a lot, most people won't get diarrhea with this, could suggest some benefit. Chastetree berry, this is the one that's been studied quite a bit for PMS. It's an extract of the berries. It's been around a long time. Apparently monks used it in the Middle Ages to decrease their libido. It's not clear that it does that, but that's how it got its name. There are some positive results in a specific extract that was studied. It didn't help with the bloating, but it would help, for instance, some with the, again, some of the psychological symptoms. It was another extract that was done that showed some positive results. And the mechanism, again, not completely clear. It does appear to have an effect on prolactin through the dopamine receptors and could improve the luteal phase. You would want to avoid it with any dopaminergic drugs. It appears to be a dopaminergic agonist to a minor degree. The safety profile otherwise is good. It's unclear the interaction with OCPs. I generally, in an effort to be overly safe, will avoid it with OCPs. And usually you're gaining good effect with the OCPs anyway. You would have, contraindications would be a pituitary tumor for obvious reasons. The adverse effects are mild. Maybe some irregular bleeding. You can sometimes improve the bleeding, so it can go either way. It used to be sold as cycle balance, and this was an interesting exercise for me as I was looking into this several years ago. So you do all this research, you find the particular extracts, and then they're not available in the market. And so looking a little bit more, talking with some colleagues, the Nature's Way Femiprin, for instance, has, number one, has some B6 in it, which we already know about that. And it's standardized to this. It also has some crude herb in there, meaning some of it's highly processed, some of it isn't, and they put it all together in one pill. Why? I'm not sure. And so it's probably a viable product, but it's not exactly what's studied. And so I would feel safe recommending it. And again, it's to some degree, it's a trial of N of 1, see how the woman does and see if it helps. Again, it probably would help. GINKGO, interestingly, also has been used, not as many trials, but in a few trials has shown some improvement with the bloating symptoms. There's one extract in particular you'll see a lot used, EGB 761, that had improvement. There was an Iranian study that showed, a very small study, but did show some improvement. It's worth noting that it's the extract of the leaf that's used, which is not as typically used traditionally. They traditionally used cooked berries. GINKGO by Nature's Way is a good product on the market, and that's the extract that I mentioned before. Some risk of increased bleeding because it interacts with platelet activating factor, and you don't want to eat the raw berries. I mean, not that people necessarily are, but it's interesting in New York at least, here in an urban environment where we have ginkgo trees, you will see people gather the berries. And you want, I mean, now that you're out there counseling, but if a patient talked about it, you would, you don't want them to eat that. That actually could cause seizures. They have to be cooked. But that's not even what this extract is about, that's used from the leaves. So back to Beatrice. Most importantly, I think, talk about calcium, important for the bone health, and also can provide some relief. B6 is another viable alternative. And then a conversation about ginkgo or chastetree berry. I didn't mention cost, but I should. Most supplements in the market, at least here in New York, and I don't think it'd be too different elsewhere, run anywhere from $10 to $30 or $40. Essentially, they're marketed so that they're not as expensive as pharmaceuticals. For some people, that's too much money, and for others, they can afford it. So it's worth a discussion. These aren't horribly expensive, typically 20, 25 bucks, I think, or less. As opposed to some supplements which run more 40 to 50. Osteoporosis. Clarice, a 60-year-old woman, generally healthy, but does have some osteopenia, so concerns about coming osteoporosis. No meds now. Takes her gram a daily of calcium, so not quite at goal. Doesn't think there's any vitamin D in that. She's interested in something natural. And again, someone mentioned soy. Surprise, surprise. So just to comment on vitamin D, epidemiologic studies have been showing relatively high rates of deficiency. There's a link of low D and risk of fracture, but it took a while, but more recently, finally, we're starting to show and a link of protection of fracture risk and vitamin D. And what the meta-analysis, which this is in JAMA, Bischoff-Ferrari, basically talked about, it needs to be not 400, it needs to be 800. The Institute of Medicine actually didn't, I think, quote as high as 800. They tended to quote more like 600 for this age group. They said elders, I think, over 75 more at 800. But the point being is that you really want to get more at the 800. You're not going to put anyone at risk of toxicity with that. And I say vitamin D. This is vitamin D3. Forgive me, I should have said 800 IUs, vitamin D3 daily. If you're looking for it, I'll often, for osteopenia, osteoporosis, will check vitamin D values. You're checking the 25-hydroxy. You're not checking the 125. And you know, the AAFP, for instance, suggests values above 30, which seem reasonable. That's where the PTH starts to rise as a compensatory mechanism. And using D3 supplementation for prevention of risk, you know, again, Briscia-Ferrari and their meta-analysis suggested that, again, you'll need about 800 IUs a day. The one thing to be mindful about is that a sunscreen with an SPF of 8 does decrease vitamin D synthesis, so we often think of sun being very you know, readily available in the summer, but if they're using the SPF like the dermatologist asked them to, like we asked them to, they may not be getting as much vitamin D. For repletion, if you have someone low, you can do high-dose vitamin D2, you can do D3. D2 is usually weekly, D3 is usually daily. My personal experience is that I struggle. There's some data that, I mean, weak data that D3, we know that D3 is a little more potent, you know, unit for unit. The question is really, can you replete with D2 and get, you know, good outcome? You certainly can change lab values, but in terms of outcome studies, it's a little harder to know for sure. D2 is easier to get with insurance. Generally, insurance companies will cover it. D3 is usually over the counter, and so it's not going to be covered. Estrogens, again, returning to that, multiple studies looked at isoflavones as extracts and looked at whole foods. Conflicting results, again, I think because these phytoestrogens are just fairly complicated in terms of how we react to them as people. Iproflavone showed some increase in bone mineral density, but no outcome. I mean, you know, we want to look at outcomes and not just simply bone mineral densities. So one study showed the equivalent of 80 milligrams daily, which is really the same rough amount that I talked about with the menopause. You know, about 8 ounces of tofu, 16 ounces of soy milk. That's a hefty dose, a sizable dose. A cup of tempeh, you know, would be something worth thinking about as whole foods if a person's interested in going that direction. Vitamin K is not something we often talk about with osteoporosis, but it is an important coenzyme in the carboxylation of osteocalcin. We know that vitamin K1 intake less than 100 mics in, you know, these correlational studies can increase the risk of bone fracture. There hasn't been many outcome studies here. There was one done in Japan where they took vitamin K2, which we don't have available, and did show a decrease in the fracture rate, even though the bone mineral density didn't change, which was kind of interesting. It doesn't really affect the calcium matrix as much as it affects the protein matrix. And then some meta-analyses done in Japan showed positive results around this vitamin K2, but again, that's not available here. But, you know, I think we can extrapolate to, again, to say, you know, sort of simply vitamin K is good for bones. You know, to give you a sense, if we were talking before about, 100 mics daily, it's not that hard to get 100 mics, as long as you eat your vegetables, you know, as all of our mothers have said for eons. You have, you know, fresh kale, collard greens, etc., that are helpful with this. And only vitamin K1 is available in the U.S. in a multivitamin or separate, so you could do that route as well. Other vitamins and minerals to think about: boron may help in decreasing the excretion of magnesium and calcium, magnesium, vitamin C, zinc, manganese, and copper. You know, none of the outcome studies are going to support that you absolutely have to have these in your diet. If you have a good, healthy whole foods diet, you probably don't need a multivitamin. And generally, as people probably know, multivitamins just don't tend to change mortality. In fact, there was some concern recently in a recent article that, you know, certain minerals taken in elders is actually could somehow be correlated with increased mortality. So I think that study wasn't clear to parse out what we should say about supplements, but in any case, multivitamins are not often needed with a good diet. So recommendations for Clarice: I think a whole foods diet with vitamin K containing foods. You could consider a multivitamin depending on, you know, how she wants to do it. Is she risk averse, etc.? Does she have the money to buy it? And then calcium and vitamin D. You really want to make sure that vitamin D is 800 IUs. Make sure the calcium, obviously, up to 1,500 for postmenopausal. And then consider checking vitamin D stores and repleting if they're osteopenic and osteoporotic. That is where the evidence lags. We don't honestly have that evidence to say, yes, you should absolutely do this. People are doing it. I will do it some. And hopefully we will get more evidence that says, look, if you have depleted vitamin D, getting it back up is really going to be important. But that's not here now. And then a last case example, and I hope I'm not going too fast. But so Dolores is a 26-year-old woman. She's interested in getting pregnant. She's a G0, P0. And she's been trying off and on with her husband. No success yet, but it's only been 6 months. She does wonder about her fertility. She's taking a prenatal vitamin with folic acid. What else should she take? What about fish? I mean, I think fish in particular comes up, at least comes up a lot here. I don't know about other parts of the U.S. or other parts of the country. So pregnancy and fish I want to talk about, and of course, you know, the concept of interconception is, as I see it, is really thinking about, okay, if pregnancy is around the corner tomorrow, then interconception needs to be talked about today. And, you know, basically fish is known as a good source of omega-3 fatty acids, what are called long-chain, omega-3 fatty acids. And again, these are most often found as supplements. There is a pharmaceutical grade omega-3, but you're not going to generally get it paid for this situation. And so the same issues: safety, efficacy, necessity. Some women may be vegetarian. You know, are there vegetarian sources? I don't want to eat fish. So fish oils. You know, to put this in context, we have, you know, 3 big type of fats. We have our saturated fats, we have our monounsaturated fats, and we have our polyunsaturated fats. Polyunsaturated fats, you know, which are all found in various forms in food, are composed of omega-6s and omega-3s. And omega-6s are very ubiquitous. They're found in many cooking oils. They're found in canola oil. They're found in cottonseed, etc. The long-chain omega-3 fatty acids are relatively difficult to find in our diet. They're just not as ubiquitous. They're probably a little less stable as well, meaning they're a little more susceptible to rancidity, etc., than omega-6. They're the 2 that you've probably heard of. Don't ask me to pronounce the full names because I will butcher them, but it's DHA and EPA. Alpha-linolenic acid is an omega-3 fatty acid that's a shorter chain from plant sources. And we actually can convert alpha-linolenic acid to DHA and EPA, but it's done, at low levels, probably 15 to 20% in most people, and it also that conversion tends to diminish in diabetics, people who have B vitamin deficiencies, etc. And I say that only, not so much the context here, but in the context around fish oil studies. If the question is, well, can I substitute the alpha-linolenic acid? And the answer is, well, it's not clear because it depends how well they convert. For those of you who do remember biochemistry from education days, alpha-linolenic acid is one of the 2 essential fatty acids. Linoleic acid is the omega-6 essential fatty acid. So prizes for those of you who remember that. I think it's one of these facts that was certainly hard for me to remember. So there is some data that longer chain, we talked about necessity, longer chain omega-3 fatty acid can be important for child neurodevelopment, especially DHA. Now these studies are not, you know, I mean, measuring child neurodevelopment is tough anyway. So they looked at IQ stuff, they looked at retinal development, not your clearly outcome studies, but those are going to be hard to parse out anyway. But so that I mean, it's also worth knowing that DHA is present naturally in breast milk. So it makes sense, obviously, that DHA as an omega-3 needs to be around in a pregnant woman, needs to be around for kids. A lot of, as you may know, a lot of formulas now are supplemented with DHA. So then the question is omega-3 fatty acids, are they a supplement or are they a vitamin? Meaning, are they essential or are they, you know, supplemental? I mean, I think the answer is they're essential. It just depends to what degree. You know, one study also suggested in pregnant women that omega-3 fatty acids can improve the duration of the gestation of pregnancy, you know, i.e. could help maybe decrease the risk of early delivery, preterm delivery, thank you. You know, basically the dose done here and the dose that's reasonable is 1 gram a day, which is not a particularly high dose of fish oil. To put this in context, a 8-ounce farmed salmon steak that you might eat in a restaurant often contains about 3 grams of the EPA and the DHA combined. They always come together in fish. So that's a gram a day is not tons. Dose of flaxseed oil that would be sort of equivalent would be 1 tablespoon, remembering those caveats about conversion. All of these can be ingested safely while pregnant, but, and that's the big caveat, is you have to do it wisely. I have here, and I know Ms. Jackson also has a resources page for you that has 2 online resources I really like, Environmental Defense and Blue Ocean Institute. And both of them talk about fish ecologically, if you're interested in that, but also some in terms of pollution issues. So common fish, I mean, it's one thing to talk about fish oils and abstract, but okay, what about tuna? I like tuna, or I like salmon because I like sushi, or I like tuna because of sushi, or tuna fish. So unfortunately, tuna probably you should avoid in pregnancy. It should be avoided in pregnancy. The mercury content in tuna is just unfortunately there that it's best to avoid it. Canned white tuna is has more mercury than canned light tuna, for instance, but canned light tuna still has some risk. If you look on the EDF, the Environmental Defense Organization's Environmental Defense Funds Organization's suggestions, they say for adults you really only want to eat canned light tuna probably 3 to 5 times a month. So that's not very much. And then yellowfin tuna is one of the common, sockeye tuna is common for sushi, and again I would say for a pregnant woman to avoid that. For salmon, farmed salmon unfortunately has issues with what are called PCB contaminants. These are fat-soluble contaminants that are an industrial problem. Wild salmon is much better, but there are present. I mean, to be quite honest, there's also PCBs present in the animals we eat on land. So, you know, limiting risk is really going to be more about wild salmon in this context. And unfortunately, I guess what I'm saying is that PCBs are probably somewhat ubiquitous, but farm salmon, we know, unfortunately does sometimes concentrate because of where they're grown, because of what they're fed, etc. So I generally would counsel women not to eat farm salmon. They could eat, you know, maybe wild salmon 2 to 4 times a month, but wouldn't go overboard. Flaxseed or flaxseed oil is something they could do for vegetarians, and if it's organic, I think you can feel comfortable it's clean. There's this theory about omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is if it's lower, meaning if there's less omega-6 per omega-3, it can be actually improve the production of the longer chain omega-3s from the flaxseed oil because they compete. These 2 polyunsaturated fatty acids do compete for the same enzymes as they're converted. Really, there's no other need for other specific vitamins than folic acid, and you can encourage a good whole food diet. And I didn't, let's see, for some reason I didn't say it explicitly, but forgive me. Fish oil supplements are also you can feel safe using. They're cleaned almost all across the market. The consumer lab I mentioned did some third-party testing of a lot of them and really only found a few that had concerning levels of PCBs. So it's worth educating yourself on that beforehand, but once you sort of know some of the better brands, we usually use Carlson's or Nordic Naturals. That's also, you know, you can encourage that. And a lot of the prenatal vitamins now have DHA in it. Nausea in pregnancy, just to throw this out, this is something we see a lot, obviously. Vitamin B6 can be helpful. There is some data that suggests that 10 to 25 milligrams 3 times a day. So you can see you're not you know, exceeding, again, that magic 100 milligrams. And then pressure on point P6 could be helpful. This is something a patient can do after they're taught it. They basically go 3 of their own finger breadths down from the crease of the wrist, and then they put pressure there. Sort of solid pressure is what I'm told. And again, the evidence on this, is it rock solid? No, by no stretches. Could it be helpful? Yeah. And obviously finding anything that's safe for a woman who's struggling with emesis in pregnancy can be helpful. Ginger, I bring this up. Many of you may or may not know anything about that. This can be used safely in pregnancy. You want to do about 1 to 1.5 grams a day, and then you divide it up 4 times a day. You know, a kitchen dose, so to speak, meaning if they want to make the ginger root themselves as opposed to buying it in pills, which I think is kind of a neat thing to encourage, is they would take an inch of the ginger root that I have a picture of here, and they would boil that in water for 10 to 20 minutes, and then they could sip that and divide it up during the day. Recently, about a year ago, I guess it was, there was some concerns about ginger and teratogenicity, This was at higher doses. This was at above 2 grams a daily dose, which generally is where you get into trouble with ginger extracts. People taking ginger as an extract in pill form. You know, if you do an inch root ginger tea, that's not going to overdo it. So that's often how I'll counsel women to do it, so they don't get into the ginger extracts, which could be risky. So conclusions, and finishing out hopefully just on time. Black cohosh arguably is useful for menopause, certainly worth a try. It's less clear regarding the phytoestrogens. Calcium and other vitamins can be useful as trials for PMS. Ginkgo and chastetree berry you can think of as helpful for PMS as well. Think vitamin D, vitamin K, important for osteoporosis prevention. Questionable about treatment, but certainly prevention. And then soy is likely important for bone health, or even menopause, or maybe health in general, but it's difficult to know for sure. But I would recommend it as whole foods. And then fish oils and omega-3 fatty acids, beneficial for pregnancy for sure. And then the issue is just how to do it safely, and hopefully the resources will help with that. And that brings us to the end, which I had the end slide and didn't get in. So that's it for me. I'm very happy to take any further questions. I know I went kind of fast. So.
We had 2 questions that came up at one of the breaks, and they should be already up.
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, I got the one about the soy can... Oh, okay, here's 2 more. Okay. I'm admittedly having a little bit of trouble seeing all of them for some reason. I'm not quite sure how to make it big. Show all questions. Here we go. Thanks. Okay, so where do the various soy bars, like breakfast or energy bar, fit into the food versus extract? It's a good question. I mean, the way I would see it is it's arguably an extract only because they have to do a significant amount of processing to then get it into the food. I guess the real question is, do you define an extract based on potency or on processing? So you could have an extract in a soy bar like these breakfast bars that has been extracted out from soy and then put into food, but it may not be a high content. And so that's where, you know, the trick is I'm thinking about these bars because I'll often look at them myself for other reasons and think, okay, so how much of this, I don't eat gluten, for instance, so how much gluten is in here? Are there oats or not? And I don't actually know if they quantify or if they have to quantify the soy content on these bars. And so it's a good question. I would have to look closer, and I think you could define it as extract in the one sense because it's, you know, extracted out, but I don't know how potent it is. I guess that's maybe where the question is, maybe as important. And then the second question is, do you have an integrative, Sabrina, how do I clearly see, oh, here it is, now it's coming up clear, the whole question. Do you have an integrative medicine reference book that you recommend? Let's see, there are 2 big ones out there. I mean, the one that I reference, the difficulty with integrative medicine is, you know, it's attempting to meld CAM into all of conventional medicine. So, you know, a reference book the size of Harrison's would not be unreasonable if you really were trying to get into all the various minutia and that kind of stuff in the studies. But anyway, there's sort of 3 books I can think of off the top of my head. The first is the specific book referenced in the resources, and that's by Drs. Mazes and Lodog, both very practiced integrative. They're both family practitioners. They both do a lot of women's health and have been doing this a long time. And so that's a great resource. They're editors in it, and they've pulled in a lot of people across the country, I think here in Canada, excuse me, who talk about different things, a lot of the things that I've gone over, but to obviously more degree. And that book is called, rats, I have it on this fake shelf behind me. Just kidding. Here it is. Integrative Women's Health is what it's called. And that's on the resources. The other 2, you'll have to forgive me, I don't know the titles, but Dave Rakel, R-A-K-E-L, is up in Madison, Wisconsin, at one of the academic center there, and he has a book, and I don't remember the title, but it's a really nice integrative medicine reference, and he does a good job with trying to find a balance between citations and evidence while at the same time being readable. So that's one, Dave Rakel. He's been doing this a while. And then actually my colleagues here, oh, thanks. Oh, yeah, I see you're putting it up, Sabrina. Thank you. So it's actually Rakel, is how you spell his last name if you search for it. Yeah, exactly. And then the other two authors who work together, both my colleagues here at Beth Israel, are Roberta Lee and Ben Kligler. So that's Kligler. So there's one L after the K too. So there's two L's. Kligler. Yes, exactly. And they also have a nice book. It's very similar to Dave Rakel's in the idea of trying to provide this balance between text and citations, and their editors did a nice job of pulling together the data and some sort of background. So I think those are two both pretty accessible general texts as opposed to the Integrative Women's Health that's obviously more specific to women's health.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, but just in case you guys have some, then go ahead and type them in. I would like to highlight our upcoming Primary Care for All activities. On next Tuesday, we have a coffee shop on the topic of caring for the pregnant migrant woman. So if we have any women's health providers in the audience, then please feel free to come back next week on October 18th. And then next Wednesday, CE approved webinars, and it's on care management. Also, I would like to just highlight the resources that Dr. Teets mentioned today. Before I do that, we are issuing a core-wide blog call. So if any people are in the audience and you'd like to do blogs, or you're a blogger, then please feel free to submit them to me at sajackson@msm.edu, and we'll get them up on the website. So I'd like to say thanks to our audience. You can still send in your questions if you have them while I'm doing our closing. So thanks for your participation in this Primary Care for All webinar series. Special thanks to you, Dr. Teets, for adding and bringing us your expertise. It was very insightful and engaging. It has been recorded and it will be stored in our on-demand section of the site for your review. I would be remiss if I didn't give special thanks to our IT team tonight, both John and Quallen. An eval for this webinar will pop up in another window for those of you using IE, and another tab if you're using Firefox. Please complete it in its entirety in order to obtain your CE credit through AAFP. Please note that on our website, in the share area under the general primary care tools and links, you should find some of the resources that Dr. Teets mentioned, one for Consumer Lab, Natural Database, Natural Standards, a couple for fish and seafood, the Environmental Defense Fund, as well as blueocean.org, and also a reference to the book that he mentioned, Integrative Women's Health by Dr. Mazes and Dr. Lodog. So thanks again for your time and your attention, and for what you added to our presentation. Thank you again, Dr. Teets. It was amazing. So
thanks.
also want to mention our sponsors again, that this series is made possible through a partnership, and it allows us here at PrimaryCareForAll.org to serve as a resource to the National Health Service Corps members and other clinicians. Direct financial support for this webinar is made possible through a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Health Resources and Services Administration, and the Bureau of Clinician Recruitment and Services. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great evening.